Hey, all, welcome back. Okay, this is going to be lecture four. We're going to be talking about the cultural determinants of democracy and dictatorship. So, in the prior chapter, we talked about economic determinants of democracy. There's a whole other strand of literature that suggests that not only, well, basically, some say that culture causes democracy, some say that economics causes a change in culture, which causes a change in democracy. And then some say economics causes a change to democracy, which causes a change in culture. So we'll go through sort of all of those. In the intro, they basically break down the two different strands of ethnicity literature, basically. So if you go back and read anything by Joanna Berner, um, man, anything by Wilkinson, um, a lot of the early ethnicity literature was what is known as primordialist perspective on ethnicity, where ethnicity is something you're just born with, right? It doesn't change, it doesn't alter, it's not um, malleable. And so they basically said, quote, they treat culture as something that is objective and inherited, something which has been fixed since primordial times. This has largely, and I would also say that some argue that, particular cultures that are primordialist and obviously cannot be changed are incompatible with democracy. And, we'll talk a bit about that. The newer strands of ethnic conflict, ethnicity literature, etc., takes what's called a constructivist approach. This is the idea that culture, ethnicity, race, language, religion is more constructed than inherited. Um, quote, cultures are malleable and are not given once and for all. Cultures can change in response to social, economic, and political actors. So there's a lot of comparative economics literature on ethnicity and politics, and how often individuals will sort of slip between different ethnicities for their political benefits. Um, there's a lot of extremism in the United States, which sort of talks about this concept, but I don't really think Americans really understand the concept of ethnicity in many countries where everyone looks the same. We're not demarcated by color or, it's more like things like urban rural, or sort of did you grow up poor and speak, particular idioms and colloquialisms that the elites do not? Or are you part of one tribal organization or another, which can be malleable? So most of the more recent research that is coming out treats ethnicity as a little bit more malleable, a little bit. I mean, how would you even say this? Like moldable, right? Okay, so the first section talks about sort of classical cultural arguments. So they talk about John Stuart Mill and Montesquieu from France. Montesquieu is one of these primordialists, basically, who believes that ethnicity or race or culture or whatever you want to call it is what it is. And democracy is not compatible with all nations. Um, Mill thought that they both basically thought that the institutions of the state should match the culture of the people, right? And so they have discourses on, what kind of peoples fit what kind of states. Mill, sort of in contrast to Montesquieu, thought that any nation could be democratic, but you just have to be careful of the culture and how you build the institutions. Um, and there are others like Jean-Jacques Rousseau from my political philosophy class that also say, some like hardline Christianity is incompatible with true democracy because Christians will always uphold God's law over their societal law. And so there are those from history who have always been very skeptical of the idea that some cultures are compatible with democracy. Um, that basically all cultures are compatible with democracy. And democracy was not really a thing until maybe the 1940s, 1950s. Um, most state leaders before that time were very pessimistic about democracy. Of course, they didn't want to give up their power, right? Um, we then sort of move on to cultural modernization theory. So we sort of take those theories of Montesquieu and John Stuart Mill, Rousseau, et cetera, and get this idea that we talked in the former chapter about how economic development leads to democratization. The idea here is that there's an intermediate variable, right? And we're calling it culture. And the idea is that economic development actually leads to a culture, which makes a democratic transition and survival more likely. And so, what does this culture look like? Theorists like Ronald Inglehart have said, this is the modernization theory. You move from sort of a primitive nation based on agrarianism and these sorts of things to a modernized nation based on modern economics, based on uh, a massive distribution of wealth into the society rather than just elites. It also increases education and people's intellectual ability. It reduces the costs of organizing because of urbanization. So all of these sorts of cultural adjustments that come with economic modernization are being suggested as leading to democracy as the citizens become more wealthy, more intellectual, more educated, and more skeptical of a tyrannical or autocratic system, right? And a lot of this comes from Engelhart. Um, we'll talk about some of the theorists. A lot of it originally comes from Alman and Verba in the 1950s and 60s, which will kick off our next section. Section 2, does democracy require civic culture? So Alman and Verba, who are really the first, probably not the first, but the most important early pioneers of this civic culture literature, and they basically say that there's three types of culture in their research, right? And they say you've got parochial cultures. So this would be like African tribes. This would be very agriculturalized societies. Then you have subject cultures. So you have monarchies and dictatorships, and they sort of throw, Islamist nations in here, monarchies, dictatorships. China would fit this. And then you have what's called participant cultures, and this would be democratic nations. And what they do, or what they did, is they used mass surveys from around the world um, to measure quote unquote culture, right? And whether it was parochial or subject or participant, um, they basically uh, they basically broke down culture into four sort of narrow categories, right? Uh, the belief on the part of the individual that they can influence political decisions. So this is what we call political efficacy. Number two, positive feelings toward the political system. Are you satisfied with the system that exists? Number three, high levels of interpersonal trust. So trust between neighbors, trust between your fellow citizen. And then four, preference for gradual societal change rather than complete conservatism or revolution, right? And so not only were these theorized and methodologized in the 1950s and 60s, but they were sort of rebirthed like the phoenix in the 1990s under people like Ronald Inglehart, who is from University of Michigan, and Adam Jaworski, who is from NYU, whose name we've heard many times in this class so far, and will again. But there's a couple problems with this, right? There's the problem of causality. Is democratization causing, modernization, or is modernization, cultural modernization, causing democracy? These are really difficult things to parse out. Um, and the findings are mixed. Some people find that the democratic transition is what changes the culture, and some people find the exact opposite, that I think everyone basically agrees that economic modernization is necessary to kickstart the entire process. But whether culture comes before democracy or democracy comes before culture is a more deeply troubling question. Um, okay, section 2B, surveys and cross-national research. So we should just sort of talk about where this data comes from. Most of this data comes from the World Values Survey. I used a lot of it for my dissertation. It comes from the University of Michigan and has been asking survey questions around the world for about 50 years. They use about 80 different countries and they offer surveys over about a 3 to 4 year period, and they sort of mark which year they did and et cetera, et cetera. Um, Man, I love the project, but we should talk about some of the problems with it, right? It's like I said, more than 80 countries with even more than 80 languages. So you're talking 100 or more languages. Context is difficult, right? Like what what does the word democracy mean in American English versus Australian English versus Burmese versus Hindi versus man, um, Mandarin? I mean, who really knows what people are conceptualizing when they hear some of these difficult words, right? Like, I don't know, efficacy, democracy, trust, participation. What do those things mean? What do they mean across languages? What do they mean across the social structures? What do they mean if you took your survey in 2010 and then this next African country took theirs in 2012 and we had the Arab Spring between them? How the hell can we compare those things? There's also the difficulty of reaching the quote unquote average citizen in a lot of countries, right? That's going to be easy in Europe. It's going to be a lot harder in agriculturalized, civil war strife African countries, or man, I don't know, a country like Sri Lanka during their civil war, or Indonesia with over 1,000 different islands. I mean, how do you do that? So some of these things are very difficult. And then the final problem that I would point out is not only are there huge differences between countries, there's enormous differences inside of countries. Think of a state like Nigeria, where you have the Yoruba and the Igbo, quite different politically empowered groups with different regions that they live in, with different levels of development, different levels of political power, different ideas about democracy because one is in power and one is not. And so, I don't know, these are really problematic issues. And then once you start indexing them, like we talked about in the past, it becomes even more difficult to understand sort of what is going on inside these variables. Okay, all those criticisms aside, let's talk about religion and democracy, right? And one of the very most famous books ever written about this was Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. It was a highly discussed and highly provocative, I would say, book. Some would call it highly racist. Um, Interesting read, though, really interesting read. So, um, Huntington basically argues that Confucianism and Islam and some other cultures are incompatible with democracy, and only basically Christianity, um, and even only Protestant Christianity really can push democracy around the world. There are some very concerning um, ideas about what that means if that's reality. I'll leave that there. But the idea that only Protestant Christian nations could be democracies and should be sort of lauded as the best nations on earth is a little bit concerning, right? Um, and then, we're 30 years on from this book being written, and it's been pretty well trashed. But it was a very, very central argument for 2 decades, basically, from Clinton all the way to the Obama administration. Samuel Huntington, especially given what happened on 9/11, strange that's today, especially given what happened, today, 23 years ago. Um, this idea that Islam is in a clash with Christianity sort of took over for a large portion of those 2 decades. Um, so it leads us to the question, of course, like, are some religions incompatible with democracy? We'll talk about this. The claims are that some cultures, especially religions, are sort of antithetical and have doctrinal antitheses to democratic institutions, right? And so Catholicism, they suggest, is too hierarchically organized for the sort of egalitarian, compromising positions of democracy. And so if you look at sort of Latin America, Spain, Italy under Mussolini, Spain under Franco, Latin America under many juntas and military dictatorships, and at least until the 1980s, when you have countries like Nicaragua and Poland being backed by the Pope wasn't very helpful towards pushing nations towards democracy, and often even tried to instill sort of Catholic autocracy. So there has been some problems with it in the past. Confucianism, and this weirdly, Huntington also sort of lumps in Hinduism and Buddhism and even Japanese culture, quote unquote. I don't know what the hell that is, like Shinto maybe, but I don't think he really understood what some of these cultures were. Um, the basic claim here under Confucianism is that this sort of respect for authority, right? Respect for your elders, respect for positions of authority, rather than individualism, and this idea of communalism and coming to consensus rather than compromise, has sort of predetermined autocracies in Confucius, Hindu, Japanese, etc. nations. Um, some some states to this day actually propound this idea, right? So if you look at some of the leaders of Singapore, if you look at the Kims of North Korea, and if you look at China especially, and even some raunchy states like Saudi Arabia, a lot of them are saying that democracy is a failed institution. Democracy could never work in our land. Democracy is failing because look at their populations. They're nearly at civil war all across the democratic West. They're angry, they're slow, they can't get anything done because all they do is argue. And so, I mean, there are some interesting criticisms of the West coming out of some of those countries. But yes, they're basically saying that Confucianism does not mix with democracy. Now, that's obviously wrong if you look at states like India, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, right? All, not all maybe the strongest democracies on earth, but some very strong and long lived democracies, especially given how ethnically heterogeneous they are, discounting South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. Um, and then with South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, very, very strong democracies with very strong democratic institutions, and very, very strong sort of survivability of democracy. So, you got to take some of this stuff with a grain of salt. When we move on to Islam, the claim is that Islam basically is antithetical to democracy because the violence of the Quran is incompatible with democracy, right? The idea that jihadism and political violence is righteous is antithetical to democracy. There's rarely a separation between religion and state. And then finally, there's this mass inequality when it comes to women. I think personally that the data probably bears this one out the most, but I also think there are other things that are to be argued rather than just it's their religion, right? And I think part of it is yes, they're the second class citizenry of women, um, but I think there are other things there, right? They don't have a lot of land, of clean, like agricultural land. It's a lot of desert. Um, there's no urbanization basically. There's a whole crapload of oil in that area, and we know that oil states tend not to need the tax base or the citizenry. So why would democracy exist? So there are other things at play here, I think, than just it's Islam. Um, but I think that the statistics bear out that like those sort of states have the hardest problem transitioning to and sustaining a democracy. So I do give it some credence, but I don't think you can blame it all on just like doctrinal Islam. I think that that's very short-sighted. And then finally, there are critics of Protestantism. Jaworski suggests that one of the big problems with Protestantism and democracy is the prosperity doctrine. The idea that the Bible teaches that severe inequality is fine, because you'll be taken care of in the afterlife, and that causes problems here in the real life with redistributive policies. And he also suggests that there's a problem with individual self-interest, right? Like everything's based on self-interest, and everything is, if you look at sort of the COVID era, there was a lot of argument over whether, whether shots should be mandated or not. And I'm not going to get into what I think about it, but there was a lot of argument about, some people were saying the society is more important, right? We should wear masks, we should get vaccines, and they should be mandated. Some people were saying, no, it's my individual right to make those decisions for myself. I prefer not to wear a mask, and I'm nervous about getting the shot because they're not tested or whatever. And so, this is a really sort of difficult thing that comes in with interestingly with Protestantism that generally doesn't come in with a lot of the others, which are a little bit more hierarchically structured. And then you have a critic like Rousseau who says that the idea that um, God will always supersede the state, and so you're going to have a bad citizenry. There are also criticisms there, so I would point anyone to go read Rousseau, and if you're looking for a criticism of Protestantism too. So, okay, Section 3B is about empirical evidence. As we kind of talked about earlier, primordialism has been all but debunked. We're going to kind of leave that one alone. There is a lot of evidence for the constructivist theory. We're still trying to figure out really how it all plays out, but we do know that race and ethnicity and culture and religion are a little more malleable than just like you're born there and you're stuck there for the rest of your life. Um, Let's see. And like we talked about earlier, Islam is probably the most concerning area around the world that seems the most incompatible with democracy. But a lot of the methodological tests don't really suggest that. Um, and but I mean, if you do just give it sort of the eyeball test, right? Like there are a lot of undemocratic Islamist nations, right? A lot of them. And even the ones that are democratic, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Turkey, um, Myanmar, right? Like these are concerning democracies. These are not healthy democracies. Indonesia might be the healthiest of the bunch, and they have real problems with things like terrorism, whether they can reach their entire nation or not. The rhetoric and the violence of their police, all of these sorts of things. So none of those countries is exactly a model for democracy. Okay, Section 3C. Are some religions incompatible with democracy? A new test. So, they threw this model together I'm not going to walk you through all this. They want you to understand how models are built and how you read them. That's one of the reasons I picked this book, is because it helps so well to show how these theories are not only constructed but then tested. But I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of the modeling. If you want to know more, please reach out to me. But other than that, I'm just going to focus on the theory, okay? But their models basically they run two models. They run 10, but we're just going to focus on the ones that include all of the control variables. Um, at the very final model in each one. I think it's model 5 in each one. And so the first model is the dependent variable is the likelihood of transition, right? From one year to another, is there any likelihood that you transition to a democracy? And in the final model, they find that only three things sort of came out as statistically significant. If your nation is majority Catholic, you are more likely to have transferred to democracy in the past year. If your GDP per capita is increasing, your likelihood of a democratic transition is also increasing. And then finally, if you get extremely high or extremely low growth, you're actually going to reduce the likelihood of transitioning to a democracy. It's a negative correlation. Okay. The second model looks much the same, but this time we're looking at, did your democracy survive? Not did it make the transition. So did it just survive the year? Catholicism actually reduces the likelihood of surviving, while none of the other religions do. So very, very interesting, right? GDP per capita again increases the likelihood of survival, right? If your population is getting richer, why would they be complaining? And then wildly exorbitant growth in this model is actually good, right? While it makes it less likely that you'll transition because there's probably chaos in your economy. If you're in a democracy, it makes your democracy more long-lived because it's spreading the wealth and it's creating more wealth. Okay. I will leave the bottom one to you, section 4, experiments and cultures. They run through the ultimatum and dictatorship games, and they're really interesting. But I'm going to leave that to you. So I'm going to call it here. Thanks for being here, and have a great day.